The psychology behind criminal behavior. An educational breakdown if you crave the darkest truths about the human mind, the kind that make you question who you really trust. Hit subscribe, like this video, and tell me in the comments, are criminals born or made? Because tonight's case will test everything you think you know. Chapter 1. The man who watched too closely. The 911 call came in at 2:14 a.m. A woman's voice, shaking but controlled. "I think he's still in the house." The line went dead. By the time patrol cars screeched onto Hawthorne Street in Portland, Oregon, every porch light on the block was on. Curtains twitched. Doors cracked open just enough for neighbors to watch without being seen. Officer Liam Ortega was first through the front door of 214 Hawthorne. The smell hit him immediately, copper and bleach. The living room looked undisturbed. Couch pillows neatly arranged. A half-finished glass of red wine on the coffee table. A laptop still glowing on the kitchen counter. But the hallway light flickered. And at the end of that hallway, the bedroom door stood open. Inside, 34-year-old Emily Carter lay on the floor beside her bed. There were signs of a struggle. Overturned lamp, shattered picture frame. Fingernail marks scraped into the hardwood. A small pool of blood had dried near her shoulder. Her pulse was weak but present. She was alive. Barely. Paramedics rushed her out as detectives sealed the house. There were no broken windows. No forced entry. The security system had been disarmed using the correct code at 1:57 a.m., which meant one thing. Whoever had attacked her knew her. Emily Carter wasn't just any victim. She was a doctoral candidate in forensic psychology at Portland State University. Her research focused on behavioral patterns in nonviolent offenders transitioning to violent crime. She studied escalation, obsession, the subtle shift from fantasy to action. Detective Sarah Whitaker, lead investigator, stood in Emily's office the next morning, scanning shelves filled with textbooks. Abnormal psychology, criminal profiling, cognitive distortions, attachment theory. On the desk was a notebook, open to a page titled, Case Study, The Mask of Normalcy. Below it, a single sentence had been underlined 3 times. The most dangerous offenders are the ones who blend in. There were no signs of theft, no valuables missing. The attack appeared personal. Whitaker's team began building a psychological victimology profile. Who was Emily, and who might fixate on her? Friends described her as brilliant but private. She had recently ended a long-term relationship with a man named Daniel Reeves. The breakup had been amicable, according to both parties. Daniel had an alibi. He was working a late shift at a downtown hospital where he was a surgical nurse. Timecards confirmed it. Security cameras placed him inside the building until 3:30 a.m. Still, something felt unfinished. Then came the digital sweep. Emily's laptop revealed dozens of emails from an anonymous sender over the past 2 months. They weren't threatening. Not explicitly. They were admiring. You understand people in ways others don't. You see the darkness most are afraid to admit. Some of us were born different. You'd find that fascinating. The emails escalated in frequency. 3 days before the attack, one read, "You write about escalation. What if you're watching it happen in real time?" Whitaker leaned back in her chair. The sender used encrypted routing. No IP trail. No name. Just a username. Observer 17. In the hospital, Emily drifted in and out of consciousness. When Whitaker finally spoke to her, Emily's voice was hoarse but steady. "He was calm," she whispered. "That's what scared me. Did you see his face?" She nodded slowly. "Yes." And Emily hesitated. It didn't make sense. Whitaker waited. It was someone I trusted. The suspect pool tightened. Friends, colleagues, students, anyone who had access to her security code. The forensic team found a partial fingerprint on the bedroom doorknob. It was smudged but usable, not in the system, which meant the attacker had no criminal record. That detail alone shifted the psychological profile dramatically. Statistically, first-time violent offenders often exhibit signs of rehearsal, fantasizing, planning, testing boundaries. Whitaker ordered a deep dive into Emily's research participants. As part of her doctoral work, she had been interviewing recently released offenders about their cognitive processes before committing crimes. One name stood out. Marcus Hale, 32, recently paroled after serving 5 years for aggravated assault. Diagnosed with narcissistic personality traits and a documented history of stalking behavior prior to incarceration. Marcus had participated in 4 of Emily's interviews. According to transcripts, He had been unusually engaged. "Do you ever worry you're getting too close to the line?" Emily had asked him in one session. Marcus responded, "The line only exists if you believe it does." Chilling. When detectives brought Marcus in for questioning, he appeared cooperative, almost eager. "I respected her," he said. "She listened without judging." "Where were you last night?" Whitaker asked. "At home. Alone. No alibi." But his ankle monitor data showed he hadn't left his apartment. Clean. Too clean. Then the case twisted. The fingerprint from the bedroom door came back with a match. Not Marcus. Not Daniel. It belonged to someone inside Emily's academic circle. Professor Alan Grant. Her thesis advisor. 58 years old. Widely respected. Published author. Specialist in criminal cognition and behavioral pathology. Whitaker stared at the report. Grant had been in Emily's house before. Academic meetings. Research planning sessions. His prints wouldn't be unusual, but security logs showed something unsettling. At 1:52 a.m., minutes before the security system was disarmed, Emily's alarm app received a remote login request. The device used? Registered to Alan Grant. When confronted, Grant didn't deny accessing the system. "I was worried about her," he said calmly. "She'd been receiving strange emails. She gave me temporary access weeks ago. Why access it at nearly 2 in the morning?" Whitaker pressed. Grant adjusted his glasses. "I had a feeling." "A feeling?" He smiled faintly. "I study human behavior for a living, detective. Patterns emerge." His composure was unnerving, but there was no physical evidence placing him inside the house that night beyond the fingerprint, likely from prior visits. Still, Whitaker's instincts screamed. Emily had said the attacker was someone she trusted. Professor Grant fit that description. The psychological profile began to shift. What if this wasn't about romantic obsession or ex-partner jealousy? What if this was intellectual fixation? Grant had built a career studying violent minds. What if he wanted to experience proximity to escalation? To observe it? To test a theory? Whitaker requested a warrant for Grant's office computer. What they found raised the stakes instantly. Hidden within encrypted folders were dozens of saved copies of Emily's research notes, files she hadn't shared publicly yet. The document explored how individuals in positions of power could rationalize boundary violations under the guise of mentorship or protection. Sections were highlighted, and in the margins, someone had typed comments. "She's getting closer. She suspects. This could ruin everything." Whitaker felt the air leave her lungs. Was Emily researching him, or had he inserted himself into her research? Then came the final, devastating discovery. Security footage from a traffic camera 3 blocks from Emily's house captured a car circling the neighborhood at 1:48 a.m. The vehicle belonged to Professor Alan Grant. Timestamp confirmed. Location confirmed. And when detectives executed a second search warrant at his home, they found something hidden behind a false panel in his study. A journal. Handwritten. Meticulous. Entries spanning years. Each detailing his observations of students, particularly those researching violent behavior. He described them not as people, but as subjects. One entry from 3 nights before the attack read, "Emily is approaching cognitive awareness of my influence. The experiment may require intervention." And the final entry, written hours before the 911 call, "Escalation must be controlled. If she confronts me, I will have to act." Whitaker closed the journal slowly. The mask of normalcy. The respected professor. The trusted mentor. But when they opened the locked drawer in his desk, what they found changed the entire direction of the case. Inside the locked desk drawer, Detective Sarah Whitaker found not a weapon, but a thick, meticulously organized folder. The label, in precise handwriting, read, "Behavioral Escalation, Live Study." A chill crawled up her spine as she opened it. Inside were printed emails from Observer 17, the anonymous admirer who had been terrorizing a student named Emily. But these were drafts, edited versions, time-stamped weeks before they were ever sent. The admirer wasn't a stranger. It was her professor, Alan Grant. The folder went deeper. Whitaker found charts, psychological models mapping subject ease, emotional responses. There were notes tracking Emily's stress levels after each email, and predictions about how she would react to fear and uncertainty. Grant wasn't just stalking her. He was studying her, clinically testing how long it would take for admiration to turn into anxiety, then into confrontation, and finally, into a situation requiring what he called intervention. Whitaker flipped to the final page. A typed paragraph read, "Subject demonstrates heightened awareness. Risk of exposure imminent. Direct interaction necessary to regain narrative control." Narrative control. The language wasn't emotional or frantic. It was cold, calculated. Professor Grant was arrested within the hour. He didn't resist. He even corrected the officer who mispronounced his middle name. In the interrogation room, Grant sat upright, hands folded, his posture relaxed. He had the faintest look of disappointment, as if the arrest was merely an inconvenience. "You think I attacked her," he said, his voice even. Whitaker placed the folder on the table between them. "You created a psychological manipulation campaign against your own student." Grant replied without flinching, "I conducted an observational study. You sent escalating messages designed to destabilize her." "She studies violent cognition," Grant countered. "I provided real-world stimuli." Whitaker leaned forward, her voice tight. "She nearly died." Grant tilted his head. "She survived." The detachment in his tone was more unsettling than any outburst of anger could have been. "You accessed her security system at 1:52 a.m. Whitaker pressed. "Your car was in her neighborhood. Your fingerprints are inside her bedroom." Grant paused, then said, "I had legitimate access to her home. She requested guidance." The lie was effortless. But psychology doesn't just explain criminals, it also exposes them. Forensic linguists compared the phrasing in the Observer 17 emails with Grant's academic papers. The sentence structures, the rare word choices, even his habit of using em-dashes instead of commas, it all matched. The probability of coincidence was statistically microscopic. Still, something felt wrong. There was no physical evidence linking Grant to the assault. No DNA, no fibers, no blood, no skin cells under Emily's fingernails. If he was the mastermind, why wasn't he the one who got his hands dirty? Whitaker revisited Emily's statement from the hospital. She had described her attacker as calm. "That's what scared me," she'd said. Grant was calm, but Emily had whispered something else, barely audible through her oxygen mask. It didn't make sense. While Grant sat in custody, digital forensics made a breakthrough. The encrypted account used to send the emails had been accessed from two separate devices. One belonged to Professor Grant. The other was a public university workstation in the behavioral sciences building. The login credentials for that machine belonged to a graduate research assistant named Thomas Avery. 27 years old. Quiet, unremarkable, top of his class. He was known for assisting Grant with data coding and interviews. Whitaker pulled his file. Thomas had been present during several of Emily's thesis meetings. He had access to her research drafts. He also had a minor disciplinary note from 2 years prior for an inappropriate fixation on another student, an incident that had been dismissed as a misunderstanding. When officers arrived at Thomas Avery's apartment, they found him methodically packing a suitcase. He answered the door with steady hands. "I was going to visit my sister," he said before they even asked a question. "Where were you last night?" Whitaker asked. "At home," he replied. "Can anyone confirm that?" "No." Inside, on his kitchen table, investigators found an open laptop. A document was on the screen, titled, "Escalation Threshold, Field Application." It contained detailed behavioral predictions, all about Emily. Under interrogation, Thomas didn't deny accessing the Observer 17 account, but he insisted he hadn't acted alone. Professor Grant said it was theoretical. Thomas explained, his voice trembling. He said, "We were observing how someone trained in criminal psychology reacts when they become the subject." "Did he tell you to go to her house?" Whitaker asked. Thomas hesitated. "He said if she confronted him publicly, it would destroy both our careers. He said we needed to control the situation." "Control it how?" Thomas swallowed hard. He didn't specify. That vagueness was Grant's signature. He was too intelligent to give a direct order. Instead, he planted ideas, framing them as collaborative research, blurring the line between academic exploration and personal obsession. Thomas had idolized him. The dynamic was textbook: authority influence, intellectual grooming, and a gradual numbing of morality. Grant provided the theory, Thomas executed the escalation. Then, the forensic results from under Emily's fingernails came back. It was a DNA match for Thomas Avery. The room went silent. He had been in her bedroom, close enough for her to fight him. But that still left one question. Why? After 6 hours, Thomas finally broke. He confessed to entering the house using the security code Grant had given him. He claimed he only intended to scare her into dropping her thesis. She was going to expose him, Thomas said. Her research was about authority figures who rationalize harm. She was building a profile, and it matched him. And you? Whitaker asked quietly. Thomas looked down at his hands. I just wanted him to see I was capable. Those words revealed the true motive. This was never about protecting Grant. It was about proving his own loyalty, his own worth. Grant had cultivated dependency in Thomas, reinforcing his insecurities and rewarding him with intellectual validation until Thomas believed he was part of something important, something groundbreaking. The night of the attack, Thomas confronted Emily in her bedroom. She recognized him immediately, which is why she said it didn't make sense. Thomas had no history of violence. But when Emily threatened to go to the university board, he panicked. He grabbed her. She fought back. He struck her once with a metal desk lamp. The moment he saw blood, his carefully constructed reality fractured, and he fled. Grant, who had been monitoring the situation remotely through the alarm app, realized his experiment had spiraled out of control. That's why his car was circling the neighborhood. He wasn't there to intervene. He was there to observe the aftermath. He was still studying. But the story didn't end there. When detectives searched Grant's office a second time, they found a secure external hard drive hidden inside a hollowed-out textbook. On it were videos, dozens of unethically recorded interviews with students, framed as research but functioning more like private therapy sessions. Grant had been collecting his students' psychological vulnerabilities for years. One video stood out. It was Emily, recorded just weeks earlier. In it, she told Grant she believed an authority figure in the department was manipulating data to protect their own image. She didn't name him, but she didn't have to. The look in Grant's eyes wasn't mentorship, it was pure calculation. The district attorney prepared charges, attempted murder for Thomas, and conspiracy and coercion for Grant. But before the arraignment, something happened. At 3:06 in the morning, the university's behavioral sciences building caught fire. By the time it was contained, Grant's office and all the original research files Emily had been compiling were destroyed. The security footage from the hallway outside his office was corrupted. Thomas Avery was already in custody. Grant had been under monitored house arrest. But at 2:41 a.m., his ankle monitor lost its signal. When officers arrived at his home, they found the device placed neatly on his kitchen counter. The front door was unlocked. There was no sign of a struggle and no sign of Grant. He had vanished. Left on the kitchen table was a single, typed note. Escalation complete. Whitaker stared at the words, her mind racing. If Grant had orchestrated everything, manipulating a student into violence, destroying evidence, and now disappearing, then this was never just about Emily. It was about power, control, and proving a dark theory. But what investigators would discover next would force them to confront an even more terrifying possibility. Grant hadn't run to avoid prison. He had left to begin a new experiment. Thank you for watching. If you found this story as chilling as we did, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into the darkest corners of the human mind. When Professor Alan Grant vanished, he didn't run. He exited his life with the same calm precision he used to enter a lecture hall. By the time police found his ankle monitor, snipped and abandoned, he was already 4 hours ahead. Airports, borders, credit cards, all flagged, all silent. It was as if a man who had spent his career studying criminals had finally become one. 2 days later, Detective Sarah Whitaker stood in the ashes of Grant's office. The fire was no accident. It was a calculated attempt to destroy evidence, specifically the research of his brilliant student, Emily Carter. Grant had made a critical mistake, though. He underestimated the cloud. Emily's work wasn't gone. It was backed up, encrypted, and waiting. And when forensic analysts recovered her final draft, the true horror of the case began to unfold. Emily's thesis had changed. It was no longer about general criminal behavior. It was about a specific type of predator she called psychological architects. These were individuals who didn't commit violence themselves, but engineered it. Authority figures who planted ideas, twisted morality, and created scenarios where others would act on their behalf. The description fit Grant perfectly. Buried in her notes was a list of names, students he had influenced. One name, Thomas Avery, was crossed out. She already knew. In custody, Thomas was falling apart. He told his lawyer. He said escalation creates clarity. He described Grant as brilliant, misunderstood, a man willing to push boundaries others feared. It was classic authority transference. Grant didn't need to threaten Thomas. He validated his insecurities, reframing unethical acts as intellectual bravery. When asked if Grant told him to harm Emily, Thomas shook his head. He didn't have to. Meanwhile, the hunt for Grant was on. Investigators pieced together his movements through public transit records and library logins. Then, a break. A bookstore in Seattle reported a customer paying cash for books on coercive persuasion. He'd asked a strange question. "Do you host community lectures?" Security footage confirmed it was Grant, but altered. A new beard, different glasses, a less confident posture. Small changes designed to blend in. He wasn't hiding. He was embedding himself, observing, maybe even recruiting. Then came the message Emily had prepared for this exact scenario. A scheduled email, set to send if she didn't log into her account for 7 days. The subject line read, "If anything happens to me." Inside, she detailed Grant's methods, how he slowly normalized ethical violations, turning research into a dangerous game. She wrote a sentence that chilled Whitaker to the bone. He doesn't see himself as violent. He sees himself as necessary. Grant didn't think he was a criminal. He believed he was a pioneer. Escalation wasn't chaos. It was part of his design. The Seattle lead got hot. Undercover officers joined a criminology seminar advertised online. The topic, authority, influence, and behavioral shaping. The guest speaker introduced himself as Dr. Alan Gray. It was Grant, calm and in control. He spoke about moral flexibility and how true progress requires challenging ethical lines. From a surveillance van, Whitaker watched him pose a question to the room. What would you be willing to do if you believed the outcome justified it? The silence that followed was exactly what he wanted. Authorities moved in. Grant didn't run. He simply nodded and said, "I wondered how long it would take." In the interrogation room, he was unflappable. He didn't flee. He relocated. He didn't destroy evidence. He eliminated flawed data. When accused of manipulating Thomas into attempted murder, Grant's composure finally cracked. "I conducted a longitudinal study on moral compliance," he insisted. Whitaker slid Emily's research across the table. "She was studying you," she said. Grant's only response was, "She lacked objectivity." The prosecution faced a huge hurdle. How do you convict a man for constructing a crime he never touched? The evidence was all suggestion and influence, not direct orders. It was a case of proxy violence, just as Emily had described. Then, forensic analysts found the smoking gun buried in Grant's deleted files, a predictive model. An algorithm built using Thomas's psychological profile. The final calculation read, probability of physical confrontation if subject E threatens exposure, 82%. Grant hadn't just allowed the violence to happen. He had calculated it. He expected it. At trial, expert witnesses explained the insidious power of coercive control. They described how charismatic leaders can slowly erode a person's moral compass until they do the unthinkable. Thomas took the stand and confessed, his voice breaking as he described how Grant made it all feel like they were advancing science, proving something important. "And what were you proving?" the prosecutor asked. Thomas replied, "That people will do terrible things if someone they admire tells them it's necessary." Alan Grant was found guilty and sentenced to 28 years. Emily Carter finished her doctorate, her thesis becoming required reading in forensic psychology. But the story doesn't end there. 3 months into his sentence, Grant started leading informal discussion groups with other inmates on moral accountability. When a counselor asked him why, he just smiled and said, "I'm observing adaptation." Then, a year later, a thesis proposal from a Chicago student landed on Whitaker's desk. It cited Grant's work extensively. In the acknowledgments, the student thanked, "The professor who taught me that true understanding requires stepping beyond comfort." The student had never met Grant in person, but prison logs showed a series of academic letters they had exchanged. No rules were broken. No direct instructions given. Just an exchange of ideas. Grant was behind bars, but his psychological architecture was still out there, evolving. Emily once wrote that the most dangerous offenders are the ones who blend in. But maybe the most dangerous ideas are the ones that sound reasonable. Grant never saw himself as violent. He saw himself as curious. And curiosity, stripped of all empathy, is a terrifying thing. This case wasn't just about one professor. Somewhere right now, someone is asking that same question: what would you be willing to do if the outcome justified it? And someone else is listening. Thanks for watching. If you found this case as fascinating as we did, be sure to subscribe for more deep dives.